Let me take you back to a time when life felt simple and peaceful. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys spending time alone, especially in my garage-turned workshop. It's not just a room filled with tools. It's my happy place, where I can forget about all the stress that comes with daily life. The smell of fresh sawdust, the hum of power tools, and the satisfaction of turning raw wood into something beautiful. It's therapy for me. Over the years, I've worked hard to make this space perfect. Every tool has its spot, every surface is organized, and every corner holds memories of projects past. But then, Greg moved in next door, and everything changed. At first glance, he seemed like your average neighbor, a guy who liked barbecues, loud music, and keeping his lawn pristine. Nothing too unusual there. But soon enough, I realized Greg had a habit of bending rules to suit himself. One evening after coming home from work, I noticed something strange. There, parked directly in front of my garage door, was Greg's old sit-in. Not on the street or even in his own driveway. No, it was smack in the middle of my property, blocking my access to the workshop. I stood there for a moment, dumbfounded. Was this some kind of mistake? Did he think this was his house? After a few deep breaths, I walked over to his place and knocked on the door. When Greg answered, he looked surprised to see me. "Oh hey," he said casually, as if nothing were wrong. "Yeah, sorry about that. I needed a quick spot to park while I ran inside. Won't happen again." At the time, I believed him. Everyone makes mistakes, right? So I let it slide. But what started as a one-time incident quickly turned into a recurring problem. A week later, I found his car parked in the exact same spot. Then it happened again, and again. Each time, I'd approach him politely, asking him to move it. And each time, he'd offer the same half-hearted apology. "My bad, won't happen again." The thing is, I tried really hard to stay calm. Maybe Greg didn't realize how much his actions affected me. My workshop isn't just a hobby. It's where I unwind, create, and sometimes even earn extra money doing custom builds for friends and family. With his car constantly in the way, I couldn't get anything done. Projects stalled, deadlines slipped, and frustration built up inside me like a ticking time bomb. What made matters worse was Greg's attitude. He never seemed to take responsibility for his actions. Instead, he acted like I was the unreasonable one for making such a big deal out of just parking. Once, when I asked him why he kept doing it, he shrugged and said, "It's no biggie. You're hardly using the garage anyway, right?" That comment stung. How could he dismiss something so important to me? As the days went by, I started losing sleep over it. Every time I pulled into my driveway, I braced myself, wondering if Greg's car would be there. If it wasn't his, it might be someone else's. He often lent his parking privileges to friends and family without thinking twice. It felt like my home, my sanctuary, was being invaded, and there was nothing I could do about it. Or so I thought. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of a battle that would test my patience, creativity, and determination. As the days turned into weeks, Greg's behavior became more than just an inconvenience. It started to feel like a personal attack. I began noticing patterns in his actions, and none of them painted him in a good light. For instance, he always seemed to park in my driveway when he knew I wasn't home. Whether it was during work hours or late at night while I was asleep, his timing suggested that he was deliberately avoiding confrontation. It was almost as if he wanted to use my space without having to face me about it. One particularly frustrating Saturday morning stands out in my memory. I had planned to spend the entire day working on a special project, a custom-built bookshelf for my daughter's room. She had been begging me for months to organize her growing collection of books and toys, and I finally carved out some time to make it happen. But when I walked into the garage, ready to get started, I froze. There it was again. Greg's beat-up sit-in, parked right in front of my workshop door as if it owned the place. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my temper in check. This wasn't just about the inconvenience anymore. It was about respect. Did Greg really think so little of me that he believed I wouldn't mind? Or worse, did he assume I wouldn't say anything because I didn't want to cause a scene? Whatever the reason, it made me furious. Instead of storming over to his house immediately, I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt one last time. Maybe there was a legitimate explanation, some emergency or mix-up that forced him to park there. So, I waited. An hour passed, then two. Still no sign of Greg moving his car. By noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I marched across the lawn, knocked loudly on his front door, and waited for him to answer. When Greg finally opened the door, he looked disheveled, like he'd just rolled out of bed. His hair was messy, his clothes wrinkled, and he squinted against the sunlight as if he hadn't seen it in days. "What's up?" he mumbled groggily. "Your car is blocking my garage," I said through gritted teeth, trying to sound calm despite the anger bubbling inside me. Again. He rubbed his eyes and sighed dramatically, as if *I* were the one causing trouble. "Oh yeah, sorry about that. I'll move it in 10 minutes, okay?" 10 minutes. That phrase had become his go-to excuse, a way to placate me without actually addressing the problem. I nodded stiffly and went back to my house, telling myself I'd give him the time he asked for. But deep down, I already knew what would happen next. Sure enough, 30 minutes later, his car was still sitting exactly where it had been. 45 minutes passed, then an hour. By the time he finally got around to moving it, I was seething. That evening, as I sat in my living room, replaying the day's events in my head, I realized something important. Greg wasn't going to change unless I'd forced him to. Politeness hadn't worked. Patience hadn't worked. Even direct conversations hadn't worked. He clearly didn't care about how his actions impacted me, and that realization hit hard. I felt stuck between two options. Either let him walk all over me indefinitely, or find a way to stand my ground. The idea of conflict scared me. I'm not the type of person who enjoys arguments or drama. But at the same time, I couldn't imagine letting this continue forever. My workshop was supposed to be my escape, not a source of constant frustration. Something had to give, and as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a plan began forming in my mind. It wasn't nice, and it certainly wasn't subtle, but desperate times call for desperate measures. If Greg refused to respect my boundaries, maybe it was time to show him exactly what happened when someone crossed them. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, helplessness, and determination all rolled into one. I couldn't stop thinking about how Greg had taken advantage of my patience, treating my property like it was his personal parking lot. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. It wasn't just about the inconvenience anymore. It was about principle. My workshop was my space, a place where I went to focus, create, and relax. And Greg's repeated disregard for boundaries felt like an invasion of not just my driveway, but also my peace of mind. I decided to take action. The first step was calling the local authorities. Surely there had to be laws protecting homeowners from people who parked on their property without permission. After explaining the situation to the non-emergency line, they told me that towing unauthorized vehicles required proof of ownership. No problem. I dug out my property deed and took photos of Greg's car parked in front of my garage. I sent everything to the police department, hoping they'd issue a citation or at least warn him to stop. But nothing happened. Days turned into a week, and Greg continued parking wherever he pleased. When I followed up with the authorities, they explained that their hands were tied unless I hired a private towing company. Apparently, towing cars from private property was considered a civil matter, not a criminal one. This left me feeling defeated but also more determined than ever. If no one else was going to hold Greg accountable, I'd have to do it myself. That's when I started researching towing companies. It wasn't cheap. Each tow would cost me around $200. But I figured it was worth every penny if it meant teaching Greg a lesson. To make things official, I ordered bright yellow signs that read, ****Paragadiki PRP Nino PARKANGALOED. Unauthorized vehicle is YLBTOWET at owners EXPENSE***. I posted them prominently near my driveway, making sure they were impossible to miss. Anyone who chose to ignore them after that would only have themselves to blame. The first test came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, I returned home from running errands to find Greg's car once again blocking my garage. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring at the vehicle as adrenaline coursed through my veins. Then I reminded myself of the plan I'd put in motion. Taking a deep breath, I called the towing company and gave them the details. Within 20 minutes, a tow truck arrived and began hooking up Greg's car. Watching the process unfold gave me a strange mix of satisfaction and guilt. Satisfaction because I finally felt like I was reclaiming control of my space, and guilt because part of me wondered if this was going too far. Was I being petty? Would this escalate the situation further? But then I remembered all the times Greg had dismissed my concerns, all the projects I'd missed out on because of his carelessness. This wasn't about revenge. It was about drawing a line in the sand. By the time Greg realized what had happened, it was too late. He stormed over to my house later that evening, visibly upset. "What the heck, man?" he shouted, pointing wildly toward the now empty spot where his car used to be. "You can't just tow my car." "Oh, I absolutely can," I replied, holding up the signed authorization form from the towing company. "And I will, every single time you park here without permission." Greg stared at me, speechless for a moment. Then his expression shifted from shock to anger. "This isn't over," he muttered before turning around and heading back to his house. As I watched him leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from resolved. Towing his car might have sent a strong message, but something told me Greg wasn't the type to admit defeat easily. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a much larger battle, one that would test my resolve and push me to decide how far I was willing to go to protect my space. If I thought towing Greg's car once would solve the problem, I couldn't have been more wrong. What followed was a game of cat and mouse that seemed endless and exhausting. The very next week, his car reappeared in my driveway, as if he were daring me to do something about it again. This time, though, he wasn't alone. His brother, Kyle, had joined the mix, and together they made quite the tag team of entitlement. When I noticed Greg's car parked in my driveway yet again, I immediately called the towing company. But before the truck arrived, Kyle showed up at my door, arms crossed and a smug look on his face. "You really think you can keep doing this?" he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Public access equals public use. You're abusing your power." I blinked at him, stunned by his audacity. "First of all," I replied, trying to stay calm, "this isn't public property. It's mine. Second, read the signs. Third, enjoy explaining that nonsense to the towing company." Kyle didn't back down. Instead, he launched into a lecture about how unreasonable I was being. He claimed Greg had every right to park wherever he wanted because our neighborhood didn't have designated spots for guests or visitors. It was ridiculous, but arguing with him felt like talking to a brick wall. Eventually, the tow truck arrived, and Kyle stormed off, muttering under his breath. As Greg's car was hauled away again, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory, but it was short-lived. Things escalated quickly after that. Every few days, Greg or someone associated with him, friends, family members, even coworkers, would test my resolve by parking in my driveway. Each time, I called the towing company and had their vehicles removed. It became almost routine. See an unauthorized car, call the tow truck, watch them get hauled away. The process gave me a twisted sort of satisfaction, but it also wore me down. Towing fees added up, and the constant tension weighed heavily on my mind. What made matters worse was Greg's attitude. Far from learning his lesson, he seemed determined to make my life miserable. If he wasn't parking in my driveway, he was finding other ways to push my buttons. Loud music late at night, revving his engine early in the morning, leaving trash cans in front of my house. It was like he was trying to punish me for standing up to him. And while I tried to ignore these petty annoyances, they chipped away at my patience bit by bit. The stress started affecting other areas of my life. I found myself dreading coming home, wondering what new headache awaited me. My wife could tell something was wrong too. One evening over dinner, she asked, "Are you sure this is worth it? Can't you just let it go?" Her question hit a nerve. Was I being unreasonable? Had I let this situation spiral out of control? For a moment, doubt crept in. Maybe I should have found a way to compromise instead of escalating things. But then I remembered all the times I tried to reason with Greg, only to be met with excuses and disrespect. Compromise requires two willing parties, and Greg clearly wasn't interested in meeting me halfway. Despite the growing frustration, I refused to give up. Every time Greg or his associates parked in my driveway, I followed through with the same plan. Call the tow truck, document everything, and stand firm. I posted updates online, sharing my experience anonymously on forums like Reddit. To my surprise, my story resonated with others who had dealt with similar situations. People chimed in with advice, encouragement, and even offers to help cover some of the towing costs. Their support reminded me that I wasn't alone, that sometimes standing your ground means enduring temporary chaos for long-term peace. Still, the battle took its toll. I began losing sleep, replaying confrontations in my head, and wondering if there was another way to resolve things. Part of me hoped Greg would eventually tire of paying towing fees and leave me alone. Another part worried that he'd never stop, that this cycle of retaliation would continue indefinitely. Little did I know, the turning point was closer than I expected. As the days dragged on, the situation with Greg began to take a toll not just on me, but on the entire neighborhood. Word spread quickly about my ongoing battle with him, and opinions were divided. Some neighbors admired my determination to defend my property, while others thought I was being overly harsh. One afternoon, as I was working in my yard, an older woman from down the street approached me. "You know," she said gently, "maybe you should let it slide. Greg doesn't mean any harm." I forced a polite smile, though inside I was seething. How could anyone think I was overreacting? Letting it slide would only encourage Greg to continue his behavior, and what kind of message would that send? That it's okay to disregard someone else's boundaries as long as you pretend it's no big deal. I thanked her for her concern but didn't budge from my stance. What surprised me even more was the anonymous note I found slipped under my front door a few days later. It read, ****, stop causing drama. Nobody likes a snitch. ****. The words stung, not because they were true, but because they highlighted how quickly people turned against you when things got uncomfortable. I knew standing up for myself wouldn't win me any popularity contests, but seeing those words in black and white made me question whether I was doing the right thing. Despite the backlash, I refused to back down. If anything, the criticism only fueled my resolve. I decided to take things a step further by installing security cameras around my driveway. Not only would this help me document every infraction, but it also sent a clear message. I was serious about protecting my space. I posted clips online, carefully edited to avoid identifying details, and shared updates about Greg's relentless attempts to park in my driveway. The internet loved it. My Reddit thread blew up, with thousands of comments pouring in daily. People offered suggestions ranging from practical, install bollards, to absurd, fill your driveway with concrete blocks. While the support was encouraging, it didn't change the fact that Greg still hadn't learned his lesson. One evening, as I scrolled through messages on my phone, I noticed something unusual outside. For the first time in weeks, Greg's car was parked neatly in his own driveway. Not mine. No sign of Kyle or any other accomplices. My heart raced as I walked over to his house, unsure of what to expect. When he answered the door, he looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. "Look," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "I get it. Okay. You won fair and square. I'll stay off your property from now on." His words caught me off guard. Part of me wanted to gloat, to rub his nose in the fact that I'd beaten him at his own game. But instead, I simply nodded and replied, "Good. Let's keep it that way." In the weeks that followed, peace returned to my little corner of suburbia. My workshop became my sanctuary once more, free from unwanted intrusions. Greg kept his distance, and while we weren't exactly friends, we managed to coexist without further conflict. Looking back, I realized this whole ordeal taught me an important lesson. Sometimes standing your ground means more than just defending your space. It's about protecting your sanity, too. And if that means towing a jerk's car a dozen times, so be it. The turning point in this whole saga came on a chilly November morning, the kind where frost clings to the grass and the air feels crisp enough to wake you up. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling through messages on my phone, when something unusual caught my eye outside. For the first time in what felt like forever, Greg's car was parked neatly in his own driveway, not mine. Not only that, but there wasn't a single unfamiliar vehicle taking up space near my garage. My driveway was completely clear. At first, I thought it might be a fluke. Maybe Greg had finally decided to take his car somewhere else for the day. But as the hours passed, the scene remained unchanged. No cars appeared, no engines revved nearby, just silence. It was almost eerie how peaceful everything felt. Part of me wondered if this was some sort of trick, another phase in Greg's endless game of testing my patience. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to approach him directly. I walked over to his house, feeling cautious but hopeful. When he answered the door, his demeanor was different from before. Gone was the cocky smirk or the dismissive shrug. Instead, he looked tired, defeated even. His shoulders slumped, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "Hey," I said, trying to sound neutral. "Just wanted to check in. Everything okay?" Greg sighed heavily and leaned against the doorframe. "Yeah, look, I get it. All right. You won. Fair and square." He paused, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I'll stay off your property from now on." His words hit me like a ton of bricks, not because they were dramatic or emotional, but because they were so unexpectedly sincere. For months, Greg had acted like nothing I did mattered, brushing off my complaints with excuses or outright defiance. Now, here he was, admitting defeat without a fight. It was almost anticlimactic, considering all the energy I'd poured into standing my ground. Part of me wanted to gloat, to remind him of every tow truck he paid for, every argument we'd had, every moment he'd made my life harder. But as I stood there looking at him, I realized that would only make things worse. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about finding closure. So instead of rubbing it in, I simply nodded. "Good. I'm glad we're on the same page." In the days that followed, things began to settle into a new rhythm. Greg kept his promise, staying far away from my driveway and generally keeping a low profile. Our interactions became minimal, he'd wave occasionally when we crossed paths, but that was about it. While we weren't exactly friends, the tension between us faded, replaced by an unspoken understanding. I had drawn a line, and he had finally respected it. Looking back, I realized this experience taught me more than just how to handle difficult neighbors. It showed me the importance of setting boundaries, not just for others, but for myself. There's a difference between being reasonable and letting someone walk all over you. And I learned that sometimes standing your ground means making tough decisions, even if they come at a cost. Towing Greg's car multiple times wasn't cheap, and the stress took its toll on me emotionally. But in the end, it was worth it. My workshop was mine again, and I could focus on the projects that brought me joy without constantly looking over my shoulder. The neighborhood dynamic shifted subtly after that. Some neighbors who had criticized me quietly admitted they admired my persistence, while others avoided bringing up the topic altogether. A few even thanked me privately, saying they hoped my actions would set a precedent for dealing with similar issues in the future. Whether or not that happens remains to be seen, but one thing is certain. I reclaimed my space, and in doing so, I reclaimed a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. As the weeks turned into months, life in my little corner of suburbia finally began to feel normal again. The constant tension that had hung over me for so long started to lift, and I could breathe easy knowing that my driveway and my workshop was truly mine once more. But while the immediate conflict with Greg had ended, its impact lingered in ways I hadn't expected. For one thing, I found myself looking at my neighborhood differently. Before this whole ordeal, I'd always thought of it as a quiet, friendly place where everyone minded their own business. Now, I realized how fragile that sense of peace could be. One person's disregard for boundaries can ripple outward, affecting not just the people directly involved but the entire community. Some neighbors still gave me sideways glances when they thought I wasn't looking, as if unsure whether to applaud my actions or criticize them. Others seemed relieved that the drama was over, though they never said it outright. It made me wonder, had I been too harsh, or had I done exactly what needed to be done? The answer came to me gradually, not all at once. A few months after Greg backed off, I ran into Tom, an older neighbor who lived across the street. He stopped me one afternoon while I was working on a new project in my driveway. "You know," he said with a small smile, "I don't think anyone blames you for standing your ground. Greg pushed things too far, and someone had to put a stop to it." His words stuck with me because they echoed something I'd been feeling deep down. Sometimes, doing the right thing isn't about being liked. It's about being fair. I hadn't set out to make enemies or stir up trouble. I had simply wanted respect for the space I worked hard to maintain. And while I knew not everyone agreed with my methods, I also knew I couldn't let Greg walk all over me without consequences. What surprised me most, though, was how much I grew from the experience. Before this conflict, I would have avoided confrontation at all costs. I hated arguments, dreaded uncomfortable conversations, and preferred to keep the peace even if it meant sacrificing a little of myself in the process. But going through this battle with Greg taught me that avoiding problems doesn't solve them. It only lets them fester. Standing up for myself wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It forced me to confront my fears, trust my instincts, and hold firm to my values, no matter how tough things got. My workshop became more than just a place to build things. It became a symbol of resilience. Every time I walked inside, surrounded by tools and half-finished projects, I felt a renewed sense of pride. This was my sanctuary, earned not just by building it, but by defending it. My wife noticed the change in me too. One evening, as we sat together watching TV, she smiled and said, "You seem lighter lately, happier." She was right. For the first time in months, I didn't feel weighed down by anger or frustration. Sure, there were moments when I wondered if Greg might try something again, but those thoughts didn't consume me anymore. Life moved forward, as it always does, and I chose to focus on the positive. The projects I completed, the laughter shared with my family, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd stood my ground. In the end, this story wasn't just about a dispute over parking. It was about learning to value yourself enough to say no when it matters most. It reminded me that boundaries aren't barriers, they're foundations. They protect what's important and remind others, and ourselves, of what we're willing to stand for. And while I wouldn't wish this kind of conflict on anyone, I'm grateful for the lessons it taught me. Because sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the greatest victories, even if the prize is as simple as a clear driveway and a peaceful mind.